Heroines and heroes on a Saturday morning here in Spain, where life is so slow and nobody gets up early. So very, very big welcome to Jim Martin. I think if you're here, it's probably because you know who he is, what he's doing for 30, 40 years in educational linguistics. I thought I would just wave at you the last book which he and David Rose wrote, just in case you don't have it, but it's absolutely full of useful stuff. The background, the theory, yes, give one to Carmen here, and a huge long 100-page chapter on reading to learn. So when you go home this afternoon or you go out, you go into the you great welcome to Jim to Madrid, and you want this one, I see. Yes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you especially for having me to catch up with what the team has been doing for the last 2 years. I came to the first meeting and the last meeting only, and what a wonderfully professional effort it has been. Congratulations, really terrific. And also thank you for setting my talk up perfectly. So we've reintroduced the role of the teacher into classrooms. That's been a feature of many of the talks, not just the Reading to Learn team, and also the idea that genres are made of language, they're made of meaning, and I want to take one more step this morning and argue that the content of the content teachers' disciplines is also made of meaning. So it's a step forward and a possible bridge to things you might consider doing next, and I'm addressing some of the problems some of you have raised when the content teacher says, I don't have time for what you're doing. So I'll say a little bit about explain our approach to the linguistics of content to our teachers in Australia. You have to remember in Australia we're working in a context where the progressivist educators removed all knowledge about language from the curriculum on the grounds that it was useless and harmful. So putting genre back and gradually trying to put language back has been a huge effort. And the secondary school teachers still would have no knowledge of language whatsoever, so we have to find a way of mediating our linguistic understandings to something they can work with. So I'll finish up with a comment on the relation of semantic waves to reading to learn, which is a very natural host for the work that we're doing, and then finish off. So first of all, informing theories. This is a joint research project informed by linguistics and sociology. Specifically systemic functional linguistics, and then something you may be less familiar with, but I think you'll all be familiar with in a few years, development of Bernstein's code theory by Carl Mayton, called legitimation code theory. And the project focuses on knowledge building in junior secondary biology and history. More specifically then, the dialogue between SFL and its concern with genre. Sorry about the slide, you can't see the field and mode book there. Discourse semantics, functional grammar, and relevant aspects of phonology, intonation. And often use that little symbol to represent this stratified approach to all the things we need to consider in language. And particularly one application of this model, the book that Rachel just showed you. And David and I did our best to write out. But Susan Fees is someone who's very famous for doing that even better than we do. And a famous book of hers called Text-Based Syllabus Design that people have used for years and when out of print has been rewritten and re-edited with Helen de Silva Joyce, Text-Based Language Literacy Education. If you don't know that book, you can order it from Australia. Just Google de Silva Joyce and Fees. And you may find that a little more accessible than the Rose and Martin, and another take on things. But it's not a reading to learn book, it's just a sort of learning to write book. And in dialogue with Carl Mayton's LCT, he's got a wonderful website. If you Google Carl Mayton, you can go and access his work. His new book has just come out called Knowledge and Knowers. It's going to be a tremendous classic in the field. He's a real genius, and taking Bernstein's work to another level. Really fantastic. If you go there, his website and his little icon will look something like that, featuring the influence of Bourdieu and Bernstein on his work. The book was called, Knowledge and Knowers, if you didn't catch that. Rachel does have the slides, and maybe can make them accessible to you as you wish. It's on the website, so you don't have to furiously copy notes. Yeah? Yeah. And the dialogue stems from 2002, when Jeff Williams invited Carl Mayton to Australia to talk to one of our national SFL gatherings. And after that meeting, we decided, well, we have to get Carl to move to Sydney and work with us, and we managed to do that, and he even lives in my home suburb, so it was a great coup, so we've done very well. And a couple of books, one, Language, Knowledge and Pedagogy, based on an early workshop that we had between the sociologists and linguists, and a further discussion directly related to the work today, Disciplinarity, and another book in press, I think now, with Carl and others, featuring the SFL and LCT work. And the recent issue, or almost recent issue, of Linguistics in Education sums up the first phase of the project I'm talking to you about today. So if you can elaborate my discussion with reference to the whole special issue of Linguistics in Education. The project can be seen as an elaboration of Sydney School genre-based literacy programs, such as Reading to Learn, but with a focus on field, especially, alongside genre. Focus on knowledge in the sociologist's terms. You know this diagram from the Reading to Learn materials, so you've got this kind of model with genre coordinating all of the other meaning-making resources in the language. And today we're particularly focusing on the variable field. Okay, so what is it that the language is doing in terms of our domestic, communal, recreational activity, our professional activity, our academic discipline, all the walks of life that we engage in. So here in David's terms, a field of a text includes the technical fields of science, social science, or technology text, also includes the plot, settings, characters, and messages of stories, and the issues that are discussed in arguments. So what we're writing about, essentially. I'll be exploring field and the nature of the knowledge that Reading to Learn programs help students learn. In particular, the nature of explanation in lessons and units of work that build knowledge, with students accumulating understandings of the field. Very relevant to this conference because of what Carl calls knowledge blindness in education. And this is reflected in the use of these verbs time after time after time in what linguists would call an intransitive way. We talk about reading, learning to write, listening, speaking, learning, reading to learn to comprehend, reading to learn to comprehend, to pass tests, reading to learn to comprehend, to pass tests, to do something in your life, and we never ask what. It's never made transitive. It's a really crucial blind spot that we're trying to address. Okay? And it's the key to opening up your work with your content teachers. So we'll start with a couple of examples of explaining, exemplary canonical examples of explaining. We'll start with an example from biology that David helpfully introduced to you yesterday already, junior secondary school. So you remember his little example, the teacher's working on defense systems, immunology. Okay, B, what are the cilia? What was it? No. A, do you know what cilia is? No. D, someone must know what they are. Hairs. The little hairs? The little hairs. Later on, the teacher is going to be summing up the ensuing discussion in a table, one row of which looks like this. Cilia, hair-like projections from cells lining the air passages. Function, they move with a wave-like motion to move pathogens from the lungs until it can be swallowed into the acid of the stomach. And that little movement in the lesson is a good example of what we're calling a semantic wave. So we start with a technical term, we unpack it into a more concrete, familiar, everyday way of saying it. And then because we've lost the specialized meaning of biology as we do that unpacking, we repack it not quite up to cilia, but back up into hair-like projections from cells lining the air passages. So they're not really little hairs in the sense of what you might think growing from your head, but something more like that. Ah, sorry. It started to echo, that's why. The echo is not awful? It's okay? Okay, so the semantic wave, in general terms, we have the conceptual, so this is not a good place to stand. The conceptual term, the unpacking of the term into everyday language, and the repacking of descriptions into the table of terms. I'll give you another example of a similar thing from history. You know, there would be massive amounts of trade going on, and you know, people visiting, their diplomats, you know, their ambassadors, like their envoys and things like that, all going back and forth across the countries. So massive amounts of trade unpacked into a more vernacular, quotidian understanding, people visiting, envoys going back and forth. Okay? So it's a very typical move by teachers down, relate the more specialized knowledge to what they consider to be more familiar knowledge, perhaps the everyday understandings, everyday language of students. Continues, so there'd be massive amounts of trades going on, you know, people, what we just read. So ideas, you get trade in ideas. You wouldn't have heard this word before. We call it aesthetic trade. So you see what's happened now, the massive amounts of trade, people going back and forth, all that discussion, trade in ideas, aesthetic trade, pushing the technicality back up to the term that's going to consolidate that understanding in the history discourse. So with the abstract concept, unpacking of the term into more familiar language about events, and repacking of activity into the technical term. So that's our unpacking of what a good explanation is. How does language do it? Okay, so at this point I'm going to focus on the kind of lexis, which I'm referring to as power words, and the kind of grammar that enables this maneuvering in biology. Okay, so we've got our little cilia example there. Teacher carries on a little bit. Basically, they beat in an upward motion from inside your body and out through your nose, waving her arms to show the cilia beating. So they beat up, and they take the pathogens away with them. And guys, I don't know if I've ever told you this, but when you smoke cigarettes, the tar actually causes your cilia to, because it's so heavy, to drop. And so your cilia don't work probably after that because they're too heavy, they've dropped. So they can't beat the pathogens out of your body. So that's one of the reasons that smoking's bad as well. All right, okay. Write this down under description. So she's then consolidating the information, writing on the board. And that's part of a big table that she's building up over a lesson or two, dealing with a certain line of defense barriers, the skin, mucous membrane, cilia, chemical barriers, and other bodily secretions, with the description and the function consolidated in writing on the board. And the students take that down as notes, and that's their basic understanding that they take from the lesson, the knowledge that's been built. Notice this is a very important example because cilia is placed in relation to the other defense barriers. The information is consolidated, and it's consolidated in writing because writing is where uncommon sense knowledge lives. We don't inherit knowledge when we're born. We can't possibly even learn all the knowledge in the world in one lifetime. It's written down, specially designed texts, designed to store that knowledge, and then people are given access to it through education. So a generalized model of a semantic wave. And what you're hoping is that these repackings back into the specific disciplinary understanding are themselves consolidated, integrated in writing, tables, diagrams, multimodal texts, whatever. Okay, so we're going to start with biology because the technicality, the specialized knowledge is most obvious in science because of the technical terms. Things like cilia and pathogens. But we have to remember that we mustn't just focus on a word, because the word is just a place in a network of relationships, or if you like, the specialized meaning of a word is one place in an integrated scientific understanding of this dimension of biology here. For example, there's also composition, the location in the body, one of the locations being highlighted in this little passage, the cilia in your air tracts and lungs. But we could also look more closely using technology that augments our perception, microscope, for example, and observe the cilia, or a picture of them, if we don't have the technology in the classroom. And we can go even further and look at a diagram of one of those cilia. Now, various kinds of experimentation and different kinds of scientific exploration have been done, which I don't know, to give us this kind of picture. You can't see that under the microscope. It's an idealized picture based on decades, perhaps centuries of research, so we understand the internal structure. Okay, so there's a general issue here. We have to integrate the understanding of cilia, depending how deep we're pushing the understanding. How many layers of composition or decomposition do we associate with the term? Another dimension of the meaning is classification. All of those technical terms are not only composed and decomposed, but they classify knowledge into classes and subclasses. We're familiar with this from the usual tree of life, if you like, where all of the living things in the world are mapped by the biologist into a wonderful diagram with the different levels of kingdom and so on. Taxonomizing. If we explore a little bit, we'll find out that cilia are a kind of eukaryotic cell or organelle. And more specifically, there are little protuberants from one of those kind of cells. And through evolution, those protuberances have different functions. Some can move, wave, like the ones we're talking about, and other ones don't move because they're primarily antennae for sensing chemicals. And then if they do move, they may be a whip action, like sperms, so they can propel themselves up, make babies, or cilia, waving, pushing things around. So again, you have various degrees of depth of understanding and generality of understanding in terms of how far you classify and subclassify the phenomenon. So the meaning isn't the word, is it? The word is just holding a place in a set of compositional relations and holding a place in a set of classification relations. There may be different principles for the classification, in other words, more than one taxonomy that's relevant. Here, actually, our interest in cilia wasn't that evolutionary perspective, but the role they play in the body's defense systems. And their defense barriers are what's often called the first line of defense or non-specific defense systems. Okay? They're not tuned to what's coming. Anything you breathe into your lungs, whether it's cigarettes or pollution or whatever, it coughs back out again. So here they are positioned in this kind of taxonomy based on their functionality if we're concerned with defense from pathogens. Here's just another one of these amazing multimodal diagrams that are sometimes treated as completely transparent, and I could spend an hour or two unpacking this for you. These multimodal texts are very complicated. They don't set language aside in the background. They have the scientific language intermodally related to very uncommon sense diagrams with their own special grammar that you have to learn to view. Here's the cilia up here in the corner, playing a role in that integrated understanding of scientific process. Technical terms don't just refer to things, entities, they also refer to processes. Things like inflammation, phagocytosis, engulfment are the names of processes that happen in science. For example, we might have one of these multimodal diagrams talking about stages in the inflammation process. And I won't take the time today to unpack this for you. It's just to say that technicality could be entities or could be activities. Technical terms, of course, are always nouns. I mean, we may derive a verb from them, but knowledge is encoded in nouns. It's very important in terms of what I'm going to say about power grammar and crucial for our understanding of what a definition is. This is a thing-like view of the world that any technical discipline is building up. The board notes in the lessons that we're working on here, inflammatory response. Fever helps reduce the reproduction of pathogen cells in localized areas. There is increased blood flow to the infected area due to vasodilation, widening of capillaries. This means more phagocytes and macrophages can quickly travel to the infection site. Now we've got this problem that the post-structurists call logocentrism. They're always accusing linguists of being logocentric. I don't know how that's a bad thing. That's our job, to study logos. But here I'm using it in the sense that you're focused on words only. That's all you see about the knowledge is this list of words, instead of focusing on the role those words play in the structure of the discipline, its classification, its composition, its sequencing, so on. And this is reflected in this notion of a mind map, or whatever you call them, where you deal with a whole lot of technical terms and draw lines between them on the board as sort of a collection of words related to a particular area. I'll give you an example of this from linguistics. Okay, so in the newspaper over the last few months in Australia, the new national curriculum is trying to persuade the states to introduce some grammar, functionally oriented grammar, back into the syllabus after 30, 40 years. And here's a teacher proudly with a little map, mind map of grammar words on the board beside her. I blow it up for you. I guess it's too small for you to see, but I'll blow up what I'm talking about again. So all the words that we know about grammar are put there and lines are drawn between them. If you come as a linguist and look at the lines, it's a rather disturbing picture. You have grammar which has morphemes, okay. Morphemes are one size of unit when we consider a grammatical hierarchy. The same kind of line connects nouns to grammar. Nouns are a very different kind of thing. They're the name of a particular word class, a part of speech. Then we have pronouns, which are a subtype of noun. We have a third kind of line, a third kind of relationship. And then we have a relationship between pronouns and abstract nouns that I couldn't give a linguistic name to other than to say that there's some kind of collocation relationship between these words. We would find them. Okay? So the basic idea in this perspective is that a field of knowledge is a word salad. It's a bag of words. It's a bag of words, and we explain each of the words, and then we've got the salad, and we understand the science, which that's completely stupid. If you don't understand the classification, if you don't understand the composition, and if you don't understand the sequencing, you don't understand the science. Just like this memory of conventional grammar is not an understanding of language. So knowledge is not a word salad. Rather, words encode specific relations of composition, classification, and sequencing among the entities proposed by a discipline. Compositional relations, classification relations, and sequencing. Uncommon sense composition, uncommon sense classification, uncommon sense sequencing. Brings us to power grammar. Nominalization, not quite right, but a first step to consider this would be to think of it in terms of nominalization. The reproduction of pathogen cells, increased blood flow, vasodilation, the infection site, verbs morphologically derived into nouns so that they can operate these understandings. Now, explanation often involves the teacher, if they're cluey, recognizing that these nominalizations can be usefully unpacked as well. The reproduction of pathogen cells, more spoken, reproducing pathogen cells, increased blood flow. This one's not so easy to unpack. The blood flow increases, the blood flows more voluminously. You'll often find yourself in this kind of tension where you can't quite get it because you're turning scientific understandings into everyday ones, and those are different understandings of the world. Then this is also very important for explaining. Scientists like to use the power of the clause grammar, technically the transitivity, to explain things. The Sorry, I think I have to leave you. The spoken conjunctive resources of a language are far too blunt an instrument for scientists to explain the world, or historians, or any academic to explain anything. You can't just go around saying and so, because, it's too crude, okay? So rather you have this kind of explanation inside the clause. Fever helps reduce the reproduction of pathogen cells. There's increased blood flow due to vasodilation. This means more phagocytes and so on. So you have the full repertoire of the transitivity resources of the language to explain one nominalized event or technical term related to another nominalized event or technical term. So absolutely necessary. Fever, this isn't really an action, is it? It's a logical relation. It's a causal relation between these two phenomena, due to not the kind of preposition where, you're going to somewhere or from somewhere. Again, the causality being coded in the prepositional phrase there. Or we might use this kind of text reference to pick up any amount of meaning. Could be the previous sentence or paragraph or whole chapter. This then means, logically, we infer now, this. Now this is actually said in spoken language. Phagocytes and macrophages can travel quickly, but I could say this means more efficient phagocyte and macrophage movement to the infection site, which would be a more scientific way of talking, and the kind of discourse that you have to get your students to be able to read and get access to, and if they can't read that kind of discourse, they can't get the understanding that the scientists are building up. So we could unpack this. Body temperature rises, and so pathogen cells reproduce more slowly in localized areas. And in teaching, that's what teachers do a lot of the time, because they've got a written text as a starting point, or a handout, or something on the smartboard from the web, or increased blood flow due to vasodilation. Blood flows more voluminously to the infected area because the capillaries widen and dilate. And, the written language is more concise, packs more meaning into a clause. When you start unpacking it, you get into these long spoken clause complexes, and so, and so, and so, and so, and so. That's one of the functions of written language, as part of the process of storing knowledge, is to store it efficiently and also get the causal relations exactly right, and also use the nominalization to package up cause and effect into just the packages that you want. Spoken language packages things into clauses. If you want to combine clauses as a cause of something, you need to package them up, and you need the power grammar to do that. Let's look at history for a little bit, moving from science to humanities. We'll find some of the same phenomena operating and some differences. Historians make use of technical terms as well. We're going to look at ancient history for a while now. For example, Mycenaean society, New Kingdom Egypt, the Augustan Age, Garum, Forum, Gaul. In relation to composition, history is comparably technical, because it divides time and cultures into a detailed composition hierarchy. Ancient societies, society in Old Kingdom Egypt, Persian society at the time of Darius and Xerxes, Mycenaean society, and so on, whatever your chunking is. Historical periods, New Kingdom Egypt after the death of Thutmose IV, the Greek world in this period, Rome, the Augustan Age in that period. Very precise cutting up of the past. Also, in relation to archaeological sites, maps, very precise decomposition. In relation to buildings, very precise decomposition. There's also a range of specialized terms that, if you'd lived at that time, would have been just everyday words. But because we don't live at that time, we're not familiar with these concrete things. So history, if you like, has the extra job of explaining these everyday concrete vernacular things from another time, another place. Garum, Gaul, the name of this place, an inn or tavern or a peddler. I mean, you have to watch these. Your students, contemporary students in Sydney are not going to understand what a peddler is. They've never seen a peddler in their life. We'll have a look at term, for example, garum. It's a type of fermented fish sauce condiment that was an essential flavor in ancient Roman cooking. And it was prepared from the intestines of small fishes, macerated in salt and cured in the sun for 1 to 3 months, where the mixture fermented and liquefied in the dry warmth, the salt inhibiting the common agents of decay. Now we know about garum because it was an important export from Pompeii. We see garum jars in the frescoes. We find garum jars in the ashes. We read people talking about garum, whether they like it or not, in the historical sources, so we know about it. But it tends not to be composed and decomposed, or classified and subclassified as thoroughly or as tightly as in biology. We don't learn precisely how garum fits into the diet in Pompeii. We don't learn precisely how to use garum to cook a meal. It's just important because it's a relic, an artifact. It's something that's left from the past. We have various sources, evidence of it, and we focus on it. But it's not integrated into a body of knowledge the way terms are in science. It's a little slice of everyday life that we have a record of, and we have a look at it, and that's really all we can do because we don't know more. We can guess more, but we don't know more. So it comes up in discussions of trade, Pompeii. Now, we looked at trade in the little classroom discourse before. You have a lot of these terms here. They are technical terms. They have to be learned, but they're very weakly classified. It's not so clear, at least for me as a linguist, with my sensibility, exactly what gets to be trade or not. And they tend not to enter into big composition hierarchies or classification hierarchies. So I call them flexi-tech. They're loosely classified humanities terms, like agency and critical and all these buzzwords, loosely classified terms. So for example, what is society? Economy, culture, social structure, politics, religion. You know, we look through the curriculum documents and the textbooks, and it includes some of those, all of those, more than those, depending. So we never, as linguists, feel we can nail it down. Or economy, okay, we have trade, commerce, industries, other stuff, maybe trade, commercial trade, aesthetic trade I'd never heard of, okay, we'll put that in. Now, I think in the humanities, flexi-tech is seen as a good thing, as an advantage. You can take this understanding and apply it to different societies in different times, take the term from cultural studies and apply it to different texts in different places. Everybody can take the term and make it mean what they want it to mean. That's not how linguists live, but okay, humanities, fine, that's okay. You have to respect that. The flexi-tech is an important part of their discourse. So that's where we get these passages where the teacher's explaining this question where the students have to discuss the influence of Greek and Egyptian cultures. What does that mean, she said. What would the influence of Greek and Egyptian cultures mean? Okay, no idea, right? What it means is if we started to look at all the things in Pompeii and Herculaneum, what objects might be showing Greek design or Egyptian design? Or Greek mythology, or Egyptian mythology, or what building dictiques, like columns. Are there Greek columns? Do you know, are there themes in their artwork? You find out that culture means an awful lot of stuff, and that's probably just examples, not a closed list. So it's, remember when we started, we said that Pompeii had originally been settled by Greeks, okay? It looks hard, but all you've got to do is look and think what things are there. Let me give you a big clue. Some of them are massive, and she starts singing, la, 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 la. Theaters, student goes, la, la. Theaters, okay, theaters are a Greek design. The Greeks invented the theater, and the Romans took the idea. So a culture is design of theaters, mythology, building techniques, and the columns, artwork, and the themes, and other stuff. Whatever you have evidence of, you include there. So, I mean, it is a technical term, but weakly classified. You still have to learn what kinds of things fit there. That would be appropriate to discuss if you could ask that question about the influence of Greek culture. We saw the trade example before. A similar problem, what is trade? And we had a little semantic wave. Remember, the waves in a class, in a lesson, can be going up and down. So the question, examples, grounding the context of the period, repacking into aesthetic trade, new examples. Trade, commercial trade, aesthetic trade. Aesthetic trade means people visiting, diplomats going back and forth, exchanging artwork, whatever. There's, in fact, more technicality to history if we move to modern history than we originally recognized. One thing you have to deal with is the isms, a whole set of flexi-tech having to do with politics and struggle for power among European powers as they divide up the rest of the world. Capitalism, communism, socialism, democracy, despotism, imperialism, nationalism, internationalism, militarism, racism, and so on. Long list of these for interpreting capitalism and colonization, essentially. These tend to be defined. What capitalism is: an economic and social system under which most of the means of production are controlled by private individuals or company. Imperialism is the rule of one country or group of countries by another, more powerful country. They're relatively weakly classified. You know, we get into arguments about what is a capitalist country, a socialist country, and so on. They often enter into oppositions, so a rather simple semantic relationship of capitalism, communism, democracy, totalitarianism, little binary pairs. And there's a reason for this that I'll come to in a minute. Otherwise, they kind of float around. They're floating signifiers, if you like, weakly classified, useful for describing different places, different times, not integrated into a big compositional classification knowledge structure, other than these oppositions. Then the other thing we have to watch out for here is that they're axiologically loaded. They're actually filled with feeling. Values are coded into them. So here's an amusing little episode from a class which shows that this is true. So the student, David, is not paying attention. And the teacher lets out a big breath. Where are we, David? You're sitting there by yourself. Can you tell us what about communism, okay? And David doesn't want to answer this. Don't make me do that. That's against my Christian beliefs, he says. So he's using the axiological loading from a particular reading position in Australia about communism as, you know, opposed to Christianity. Now that's not a content opposition. It's not an epistemological opposition. Christianity is opposed to Buddhism or opposed to atheism. It's not opposed to communism. But he's taking advantage of the axiological load in the term. And the important point here is in modern history, you have to, and ancient history too, you can't only learn the facts, you have to learn the values. It's, interestingly, for modern history, slightly left of center in Australia. So if you're looking at Vietnam, you have to value the Vietnamese nationalism and devalue the American and French colonialism. That's your position, that you're positioned to do that. And you have to have those values in the exam or you won't do well. Ancient history is much more conservative. Everything's a march of progress, a march of civilization, the European powers civilizing the rest of the world and all that nonsense. Okay, rape, kill, pillage, murder, destroy, civilize, yeah. If we turn to power grammar, we find a discourse that's even more abstract than science. So if it's less of a problem in terms of power words, it's more of a problem in terms of power grammar. Mount Vesuvius doesn't erupt. We have the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. We don't ask when Fiorelli excavated Pompeii. We talk about his excavation of Pompeii. We don't say that someone died. We talk about their death. So, we looked at explaining inside the clause in science. That's, if anything, even more important in history. Andrew Wallace states that while Pompeii is one of the most studied of the world's archaeological sites, it's perhaps the least understood due to past neglect, damage, and a failure to document carefully, if at all. Okay? So here's the little due to, and we start piling up the causes. Because in history, we often have multiple causes. What were the causes of World War I? Multiple effects. What were the effects of the Treaty of Versailles? Everybody has to write these exam questions over and over again in the English-speaking world. Yeah? And this is the discourse that you need to do it, to introduce multiplex causality. The revolution in Pompeii began with Fiorelli's stage of occupation. Okay? Can be temporal ones as well. Instead of something, then something else, you find verbs and prepositions that integrate temporal movement inside the clause. So you can package up just the set of events that you want, that happened before or after, just the other set of events you want. Nominalization is the way of packaging up the meaning. Or Fiorelli's stage of occupation allowed for greater documentation, more archaeological artifacts left in sight, and the breakthrough process of injecting liquid plaster into the body-shaped cavities made by solidified ash, and the eventual decomposition of bodies. One sentence. That's what you're dealing with in history. That's what they have to learn to be able to read. And for examination purposes in Australia, since we're a culture where the students write for 2 or 3 hours in every subject at the end of secondary school, the top students learn to write that discourse as well. So here the verb again, it's not about a mental process, a material process, it's a certain kind of cause allowed for. The huge advantage now is that we have a fine-tuned instrument for explaining. Did fear early stage of occupation allow for greater documentation, etc.? Or did it encourage greater documentation, etc.? Or did it contribute to greater documentation, etc.? Or did it precipitate greater documentation, etc.? And if you want to sound like you have a sophisticated interpretation of the past, you need this full array of causal verbs in the grammar to interpret what's going on. And on either side, the nominalizations that package up the cause and effect into just the packages you want. Otherwise, you'll sound like you're retelling the story of the past. History is not a retelling of what happened. History is an explanation, an interpretation of what happened, using this power grammar to explain. The clause is far more delicate and far more powerful than an intertext, interclause relationship to explain. Okay? And historians take even more advantage of that than scientists. Scientists don't want a whole lot of cause. Scientists want one cause, thank you. A, therefore B, fine. But historians, and the humanities generally, many, 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 many kinds of cause. If you want many kinds of cause, you need power grammar. I can do power composition pretty easily because it's already, in fact, been discovered by McDonald's restaurant. So here's my fancy way of talking about layers of prediction, looking forward in a text, and layers of summary. But I've recently found if you Google the term hamburger writing and find out how the Americans talk about this, you will find, like a juicy hamburger, a good paragraph needs 2 things to hold it together. A topic sentence and a conclusion sentence, and in between you have details and elaborations. Fine, bueno, okay. You don't want linguistics, have a burger. Okay? So it's their way of talking about hypertheme and hypernew. Remember that rhetoric survived in America, it died in all the rest of the English colonial world, and so they have these little vestiges of rhetoric left, not much. Okay? You can even have a Big Mac. Have an introduction, paragraphs, final paragraph, and so on. So for storing historical knowledge and storing scientific knowledge, you need a text that's scaffolded, that parcels that information up, using periodicity, to put it technically, and headings, topic sentences, introductions, summaries, indexes, table of contents, so the little map scaffolding so you can find your way around this knowledge. Yeah? So I'm running out of time. Let's say we're talking about conserving Pompeii. We've got our source documents, hopefully. Ideally, we have a textbook that hasn't degenerated into a coffee table book of just pictures. It still has verbiage there and models of writing. Some of the textbooks have degenerated into coffee table books with pictures that are apparently transparent, or your teacher gives you a handout. This would be more typical in Australia. The teacher's got above the desk things she's photocopied over the years from many different sources or downloaded from the web, and picks out the one for today, photocopies it, gives it to the class, or perhaps now just sends it electronically, says, read this before class. Read that. Come to class. Then I'll ask you questions about it. I'll test you, and we'll play guess what's in my head about this text for an hour or two. So that's the source material for this text I'm building here. Pompeii is one of the world's most studied archaeological sites, but it's been plagued with serious conservation problems, including poor restoration work, damage from vegetation, pressure from tourism, and poor site management. So I'm going to set up a favorite little history genre, factorial explanation. Pompeii was a lot better not being discovered. Since it's been discovered, a lot more damage has been done than the volcano did. Okay, so why is it that it's so much at risk as a site? So in terms of genre, you have the outcome, the factors, and the wrap-up. Carolyn Coffin's wonderful work on history discourse. And then in terms of periodicity, there's a big macro theme and a macro new, and each paragraph has a little topic sentence or hyper theme. Okay. Now, furthermore, if we think about now this piece of writing as a semantic wave, I've got it a little more technically labeled than we need today, but we're at our most abstract technical level in the introduction. Then the topic sentence makes it a little more concrete, and then the paragraph a little more clear, condensed, vernacular still. And then we do it again and again and again, and then we crank it back up again to the conclusion where we say, as a result of these factors, the description of Pompeii as a victim of state neglect and indifference and an archaeological catastrophe of the first order is an apt one. Its ongoing destruction since its discovery in the 1590s has arguably resulted in a greater disaster than its initial destruction by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius 1.5 millennia earlier. Okay? So your wave is sort of going down in a way and then coming back up again into your sophisticated interpretation of this piece of history. So waves aren't just for explaining in classes. The wave structure is what we've described as periodicity in the organization of your texts. And this is also the solution to your teachers telling you to be critical and objective. How can I be critical and objective? So you're critical in the colored bits, the higher level bits, and objective in the not colored bits, so you get this feeling of interpreting evidence, interpreting evidence, interpreting evidence. I'd need to show you some appraisal to show you how this really works, but it's a very important part of this periodicity structure. The power words and power grammar are absolutely essential for building the higher levels, where you're condensing a lot of information and a lot of value. So here, the poor restoration work, damage from vegetation, pressure from tourism, poor site management, all that power grammar and technical terms there loaded up so that it can predict all the things you're going to talk about. Okay. I'll try to relate this now a little bit to your reading to learn work, because it's a very, very natural host for these ideas. Okay, so focusing on field now. How do we manage field in a reading to learn program? So one important point to keep in mind that genres are resources for packaging content as text. And content is also organized. It's not just the genres that are organized and made of meaning. The content is organized and made of meaning too. the composition, classification, sequencing relations we've been talking about. Of course, each genre is a special way of packaging the content of a field. Every field needs an array of genres to get its knowledge built from different angles. And David, if you're in the Reading to Learn program, has this wonderful map of the key genres, genre families relevant to secondary school. It's another step to then think, in my subject area, which ones are the key ones for building knowledge? Okay. Now, the important thing here is that the scaffolding interaction cycle is a perfect resource for explaining using semantic wave, starting with the uncommon sense meaning, unpacking and repacking it. The prepare move in Reading to Learn is essentially one where you try to make contact with what the students know. Maybe their everyday understandings, or understandings you've built up that you're sure the whole class shares, shared knowledge. Then there's some kind of task which ups the ante. You've got a challenging text, you've been prepared for it, you go there to see, okay, now what is this specialized understanding this text is encoding? And then you have your elaboration move, and I'm going to suggest there's a couple of things you could do there. You can either, again, try to make contact between the specialized knowledge and more familiar or everyday knowledge. Or, came up yesterday when David and Susanna were chatting, you might want to push it a little deeper. Still, integrate, make some connections like I was talking about earlier. I've done this very generally now. You're going to power up or power down. Elaboration move, in a sense, you power down. So the students have access to what you're talking about. The challenging text is going to power up. The technical terms, the power grammar, maybe aspects of the power composition are going to be in focus. Then I think the elaboration move, you can go either way. Either power down again, make it more familiar, or power it up, integrate. It's a good place to do the integration into the composition hierarchy, or the classification hierarchy, or the integration into the sequencing. So in terms of detailed reading, if we took examples, our prepare, identify, elaborate, detailed reading cycle. Take an example like this. Suppose working on this little bit of text. Cytoplasm is the part of the cell inside the cell membrane, but outside the nucleus. In the cytoplasm, hundreds of chemical reactions take place, transferring energy, storing food, and making new substances. This activity within the cells is called metabolism. So you're going to prepare. The next sentence tells us what happens in the cytoplasm. I'll read the sentence. In the cytoplasm, hundreds of chemical reactions take place, transferring energy, storing food, and making new substances. Can you see what takes place in the cytoplasm? Hundreds of chemical reactions. Exactly right. Let's just highlight chemical reactions. So it's a difficult text. We're preparing what happens, and then when you can read it, you're powering up into power grammar and power words. It's technical, and it's grammatically metaphorical. Normally, we might expect the elaboration move, especially if it's a very challenging text and the students are struggling, to be powering down. Then it says that 3 things those chemical reactions do, 3 functions. Student's name, what's the first one? Transferring energy. That's right. Just highlight energy. Transferring energy means taking energy from a chemical reaction to do other work. Yeah. So 3 functions here. Prepare. Power up, transferring energy, unpack it. Not back down to where you started, but part way. here. What's the next function? Storing food. Right, highlight that. One way cells store food is by converting nutrients into glucose. This time you cranked up. Okay? Storing food in the elaboration is made deeper. Making new substance, making hundreds of different chemicals. Chemicals is more technical than substance. Hundreds of is more specific than some. Okay, so just in summary, you could adapt at that level for detailed reading what I'm saying when you're working on these kind of texts. And it's a rich resource generally, if you think about the meaning of cycle at all the different levels. Okay, I need to wind down now. I'll just finish with a comment on building knowledge. Our American colleagues talk about high-stakes reading, high-stakes writing. High-stakes reading means you have to deal with the written discourse where the knowledge is stored, in whatever discipline. A teacher can actually, in speaking in the classroom, deal with only a fraction of what needs to be learned. And then we have high-stakes writing, where publicly you have to show that you have acquired that knowledge. And in between, we hopefully have a series of semantic waves where the teacher mediates between the source of the knowledge and its reproduction for evaluation purposes. Beginning where the students are at, and then waving and gradually pushing up until we've got to the point where we have the kind of understanding that's expected. Unfortunately, the typical pattern that we found in our science and history classrooms we call the down escalator. It's logocentric. A particular unknown word is fastened on by the teacher. The teacher then plays guess what's in my head with that word until 2 or 3, 4 goes later, one of the bright students relates it to a common sense understanding. And then the teacher stops. And then the teacher picks another difficult word and plays guess what's in my head again until the bright student gets it. And then another one, and it goes on for hours, day after day, week after week. Very segmental. Those words are not integrated with each other, and there's no repacking like I showed you at the beginning of the lecture. The students are dumped into common sense over and over again. So what explanation seems to mean is, I will take the specialized understanding, pretty well bleach it and gut it of meaning, and give it to you. And you'll understand it in everyday terms. And that's considered to be explaining, and that's not explaining. So what's actually going on is that reading is not taught, because that was supposed to happen in primary school, or if not in primary, the parents should have done it. Students are wiped out. We're using a surfing metaphor. They fall off the wave into common sense, and writing is not taught. The science teachers and the history teachers and all the content teachers, when we come to them, complain that the curriculum's too full, they're too busy, but they're so incredibly inefficient. It is unbelievable. It is so boring for most of the kids. I'm trying to tool you up. So you can't be as blunt as I'm being, but they're mainly wasting time. They're mainly wasting time. The knowledge lives here, and they're not teaching reading, and the students have to prove it here, and they're not teaching writing, and the talk continually turns the knowledge into something that isn't what history is, or what biology is. We could be teaching reading and writing. And just to be me, I think we should just stop the content teachers talking. They should be teaching how to read the texts that code the knowledge in the discipline. That's where the knowledge lives. And then teach how to write it, because that consolidates the knowledge and gives the students the power to show that they know it. You should be, instead of letting the content teacher tell you, go away, I don't have time, you should be saying to them, why do you bother talking? Why do you waste so much time? Why don't you do this? Your students will learn a lot more. Anyway, there's plenty of talk, as you know, in this program. I mean, the basic thing here is you want your students to be able to read, because it's so much more efficient to get knowledge from reading. You want them to be able to listen to a lecture by the end of high school. What happens in Australia, you go and look at the different schools. We have had terrible right-wing governments. Our system's divided into public and private. We have all these elite private schools. Okay, go there. Go look what happens at the end of high school. The biology history teacher are standing there lecturing to the students. Go to the other classrooms where all this stuff about activities, and the students are doing things like, you know, pretending they're Romans or Egyptians, and they're doing experiment after experiment after experiment. They're going nowhere. It's such an inefficient use of the time, but it controls their behavior. Because you haven't taught them to read or write, they'll act up otherwise, so you do stuff. And then, if they're not high-stakes writing in high school, which is a real worry in the Spanish-speaking world, I can see there's nowhere near enough writing happening in high school. They're going to have to write in university if they go there. And it's a big crisis in Spanish-speaking universities in Latin America, and here I think students coming with no ability to write academic discourse, so a crisis produced. And if you want a curriculum where people are accumulating knowledge, building knowledge, understanding on common sense discourse, you have to change the practice of the content teachers. You have to somehow find the way of making see not only genres are made of meaning, but their knowledge of their discipline is made of meaning too. So, power words, power grammar, power composition, power on. If you want to read about the project, you can have a look at that journal. Power to you.
Thank you very much. Well, couldn't possibly stop Jim with what he was, what he was telling us. I think we've all been here sitting on the edge of our seats. There's not really much time, maybe 2 comments, questions. I expect Caroline, I don't know, is it as expert on history, or any questions, or out into the patio and have a coffee and ask something there. Let me see, anybody jumping up and down? Nobody, we're all... Yes, Joanne. Sorry.
It's pretty obvious what I'm going to say, and I think probably a lot of people already know it. But in the teaching of English writing here, and especially university contexts, I think that we are hindered by the non-teaching of writing in the students' native language, in Spanish, so that we don't really have anything to go on. And I mean, there's no transfer there. Even at university, some people have considered that we just go on teaching a rather common sense English to chat with people. And it's very uphill having this negative background from the Spanish writing, plus some people even in our field insisting on non-academic language.
It's really unfortunate because the Spanish academic discourse and English academic discourse converge quite a lot, because you know, the French wiped out English academic discourse, and then they had to get it back again in 1500s, and they had to get it back from the French. So the vocabulary and so on is much closer in academic discourse. So if they did come to university with some Spanish academic discourse, that would help for teaching English academic discourse. I mean, the whole communicative language teaching program, that whole situational learning, the whole progressivist push really depends on knowledge blindness and just teaching how do we catch the train and, you know, what do I have for breakfast over and over again when at university level you're trying to teach the academic discourse. I mean, all the strategies of genre-based programs suit themselves to be an embedded literacy program. And if you're in language department, you need to think, how can we possibly team up? How can we team teach with the people in the areas? I mean, you have some expertise in your training, I suppose, for dealing with the kind of academic discourse that you find in lettres. So you can deal with narrative and literary criticism and some things like that. But for the others, that high-level knowledge, you need to be team teaching with someone and somehow reorganize the whole conception of things. Of course, what universities like to do is open a writing center. They get it isolated over there in one building, give it some money to teach how to go to the train station or something. But, you know, it's got to be team teaching, it's got to be integrated and embedded, and then you can take off. Good luck.
Thank you. I think we better stop here. I think we've got a lot to think about and digest and become very powerful, all of us, and stop wasting our time. So many, many thanks, Jim. Very brilliant and very interesting.